So Jerry Wemple, a Pennsylvania native, writes frequently about the people and places of the Susquehanna Valley. His work includes 3 poetry collections. You can see it from here, selected by Pulitzer Prize-winner Yusef Komunyakaa. I'm necessarily going to mess that up, so my apologies. Komunyakaa for the Naomi Long Madgett Poetry Award, the Civil War in Baltimore, and the Artemas and Arc, the Ridge and Valley Poems. He's also the author of 2 poetry chapbooks. He's the co-editor, along with Marjorie Maddox, of the Anthology of the Commonwealth Contemporary Poets on Pennsylvania. Wemple and Maddox have begun their work on the 2nd anthology of the Pennsylvania poetry. His creative nonfiction has been published in several venues, included in the online journal Full Grown People and the news magazine onyx.com. He is a professor of English at Bloomsburg University of Pennsylvania, where he teaches creative writing. And we are so thrilled to have him today. Thank you so much for being here, Jerry.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for inviting me. I'm glad to be here. I'm going to start off with a poem by someone else, by Harry Humes, who was a graduate of Bloomsburg. Back then, I think it was Bloomsburg State Teachers College. All the state system schools started out as teacher training institutes. Bloomsburg in 1839. But he is from a little town called Girardville in Schuylkill County. Harry is 86 years old now. He graduated in the early 60s. He went into the Army for a couple of years in the late 50s. And when he came out of the Army, his father, who was literally coughing up blood, said, "Harry, you don't want to go down to the mines. Those aren't the place for you." And he also knew that the mining, that at least the deep mining, was ending in that area of the state. And so Harry went to Bloomsburg and became an English major, and then went on to graduate school. Had a great career, published about 12 books, won some major awards for his work. But he always wrote about the places that he knew well, and he knew the coal region well, and he knew actually a lot of the state fairly well, because he was a fly fisherman, and he always liked to go travel to these streams where we hear of that the best trout stream is over here, of that lore. But this is about when he was growing up, and there was an actual person called the Great Wilno, and he was a human cannonball. And you can look, Wilno is W-I-L-N-O, and if you go on the internet, you can actually see pictures of Wilno being fired out of a cannon. And I think about a time maybe in the late 40s, a long time ago, when nobody had television, and you lived in this little small town and you really didn't get out. And here comes this carnival, this circus that's going to set up in your town for a whole week and put on these great shows, and how fantastic that must have been. And so this is a poem about this guy, the Great Wilno. Dressed in a silver skin-tight suit, he'd come out of the red and yellow tent, his cape rising behind him with each step, and a beautiful young girl in sequins holding his hand in the night that arced over the Pennsylvania mining town, and walk to the flatbed truck with its mounted black cannon, where the beautiful girl in tights would take his cape and kiss him goodbye as he climbed a ladder and lowered himself into the muzzle, waving once to us before sinking from view, a large clock showing the seconds he left before the explosion. Hardly a sound in the fairground, the bats in and out of the shadows, and across the Black Creek, a child crying. And then the whoomp of it, and the smoke, and the Great Wilno flying out, helmet and goggles filled with the blaze of lights from 2 Ferris wheels. He'd sail over us each night for a week, free of us, somersaulting among the stars, high in the darkness over the valley, until I'd imagine he'd never come down. And so come to another town, become a clerk in a grocery, marry, have children, buy his own small store, and once in a while on summer evenings, run his fingers over the powder burns on both his arms and wonder. But down he'd come to us, and to the girl in sequins who would run to the net beyond the Ferris wheels. Down he'd come like a toy parachute dropped from a Piper Cub, and at the last minute roll over in the air to hit the net perfectly on the small of his back, spring to his feet, wave to us again, then do a rollover along the net's edge, a backflip to the ground, and vanish with the beautiful girl, while the rest of us turned home, talking about Wilno and the girl, about the red and yellow tent, about the years ahead of us, about what we were going to do. I think that's a great poem, ending what we were going to do. So, yeah, I read some poems from my latest collection, Artemas and Arc, the Ridge and Valley poems. If I lived for a long time in central Pennsylvania, and then I left as soon as I could. As soon as I turned 18, I'm going to New York, and I went to New York for a while, and then I joined the military, and I went all over the world. Then came back, and I was a reporter in Massachusetts for a newspaper for a while, and then I went to graduate school, and then somehow I ended up as a professor at this college, like 20 miles upriver from where I started. I don't know, but that's what I guess what was intended for me, and I've enjoyed it. So, but this is a series of narrative poems. And there's a couple of narrative strains. So one poem leads into another. I'll have to fill in some gaps here and there. So I'm just going to read like kind of one strain that sort of talks about this one character. His name is Ark, and then kind of talks about his I don't know, this romance that he sort of has. So, but starts off when he's pretty young, when he's just maybe in first or second grade. His mother's name is Daisy, and she's referenced here. A flower rests. Daisy rose later in the morning each day until she barely rose at all. Ark was left to get his own breakfast, peanut butter smeared on doughy bread, a pale apple in a paper bag to take for school lunch. He would shuffle down the slate sidewalks parallel to the river street, doing his best to slow time and the inevitable. After school, the return trip home, and sometimes there deposited on the couch in front of a blurred television, his mother, like a monument to a forgotten whatever. Sometimes she would cook supper and sometimes not. And sometimes the old neighbor woman would stop by to say, "Mind if I borrow your boy for a while?" And then sit him in her kitchen table and stuff him full on potatoes and greasy hamburger and sometimes apple pie. That was not too bad. So Ark doesn't have a lot of resources, but through a couple of situations, he's able to buy an old Triumph motorcycle, and that becomes like his like kind of his sole possession, and something that he always likes to ride that motorcycle. And this is at a time when he's about 16 or 17. It's called Rain. Ark defeats Triumph. He understands. The weight of the machine slips away. Ark anticipates the dull thud of the bike on the wide oak 10 yards down. But tires catch on a dry patch. The bike rights. Ark's left foot gears down and he goes slowly home. Months later, he's running the bike up and down Chestnut Street, going with the traffic, then against. Except there's not much traffic since it's 3 a.m. The bike drifts past the closed stores, the bar on the corner of 2nd Street, funeral home a couple of more blocks down. Machine and its rider like ghosts, hardly noticed over the rumblings of the long haul trailer trucks coming off the State Hill onto Front Street. Still, Ark knows the cops are coming, so he heads down the alley, cuts the motor, pushes the heavy machine out back of Fat Barnacle's place, past Furman's garage. This poem jumps back in time just slightly to maybe where Ark is 12 or 13. It's called Night. Night falls suddenly when the sun declines behind these rolling hills. The boy sits on the riverside of the flood wall, his back to the town. He smokes a cigarette, counts the cars and tractor trucks on the state road across the water, wonders where they're bound. The boy would like a car or some way, any way, to leave this town, to drive past the farms until the hills grow and the woods thicken, and sit beside the tiny stream that is the start of this half-mile wide river. The boy rises and heads into town. He walks past the little park, a few blocks up Market, enters a tiny hot dog restaurant, nods to old Sam, who started the place after the war. Sam knows, fixes one with everything, uncaps a blue birch from the old dinged metal floor cooler, while the boy fingers a token in his pocket. Outside, the wind rises and shifts. And in this poem, we learn of this young woman who he starts to get involved with. It's called Ark and the Girl Were. Ark and the girl were in love. Her name could have been Cynthia or Jane, Lisa or Deborah or Susan, but it was not. It was Lilith, a name her mother got from a magazine, a fanciful name for a plain place. Still, it suited her, a bit whimsical, full of promise. They'd known each other since about forever. On a summer playground, he watched her skip rope, and they moved on schoolyard swings together. A couple of years later, Ark sometimes walked her home from school, though he lived on the far side of town. They were young then, and that was all there was right then. One summer she moved, not far, but to a nice house on a hill in a tract outside of town. That's all there was for then. And this poem is kind of later on in the relationship, but they're both still in high school. Though he did not know him, just knew of him, the girl's father hated Ark, hated all like him. The man reckoned he'd worked hard enough to make his distance between them and him, his family. When he found out, and there is always a finding out, he waited for the girl to come home from school, cornered her in the entryway, slapped her powerful hard across the mouth. By instinct, the mother too slightly recoiled, but did not enter the mix. The metallic taste of blood crept into the girl's mouth. She walked silently to the bathroom, spit a few times into the white porcelain sink, did not answer the mother who so quietly asked the girl if she was all right, if she needed anything. The girl felt vacant. After that, the girl laid low a long while. In early winter, she got a late shift clerk job at the hospital. In spring, she graduated from the high school, got a walk-up apartment off a side street and down a small alley in a little town across the wide, muddy river. In some of these poems, the titles there are other references to things like music, like songs. And in part, they're to place the reader in time, because Artemas is someone of the 40s and 50s and into the 60s. And Ark is of that next generation. So he's coming of age in the, he's a little kid in the 60s and coming of age in the 70s. And I reference Etta James here, who was a really well-known singer, and one of her most famous songs is I Would Rather Go Blind. Ark and Lilith went on a year or so like this, meeting late at night, sneaking as though they were the ones who needed to feel shame. It was a small town. She still fearful for herself, for Ark. Sometimes they would go away 30 or 40 miles to a park, upriver, a little restaurant in another town. But sometimes is only sometimes. The girl cried one night, sitting in her yellow sundress on Ark's battered blue couch. Said she was sorry there couldn't be more, something better. Some nights later, Ark rode to the hospital lot just before the end of her shift to talk, to tell her of his idea, a plan. She was there, leaning against some farm kid's pickup, sharing a cigarette with him, twirling her hair. This one's called Ark Revs the Ghost Machine. Ark climbs the hill south of town, walking first under the viaduct, jumping over the creek edge with early winter ice, small and shallow this time of year. He scrambles up the steep incline and heads east, mid-ridge, parallel to the creek, moving toward the center of town. You can't see much, even in the bright day, because the woods are heavy with white oak, patches of yellow pine. Here and there he catches glimpses, a spire, the high rise that houses old folks. Some sounds rise too, car horns, men shouting, a backhoe backing up, the noon whistle. He follows the ridge path as it drops, meets the creek once again just past the town line. He walks the railroad right away back, cuts behind the carpet mill, catches 10th Street, then Market. A few more blocks, then goes into old Sam's place. Sam is serving 2 telephone workmen, but turns and gives Ark a nod, says, "Ain't bad out today, huh?" Ark shrugs, takes a stool seat at the short, worn Formica counter. "Won't kill you," Ark says, and motions his order in a shortcut language understood by both men. Ark's pulse comes down a bit. His breathing steadies, slows. His engine still hums. He still thinks of her. So, one of the greatest bands in the history of rock and roll is Thin Lizzy. That's my opinion, but and I always listened to that band, and they were headed by a guy named Phil Lynott, who said he was one of 4 Black people in Ireland. His father was, I believe, Nigerian, but his mother was Irish, and he was raised by his grandparents in Ireland. And he was a fantastic songwriter who unfortunately died young. So I stole the title of one of their songs. I guess you might have, if you never heard of anything else by Thin Lizzy, you would have probably heard that song, "The Boys Are Back in Town," which is kind of played a lot every early summer. But this song, or the title I'm using from one of their songs, is called "Southbound," and I have a little epigraph. "Tonight after sundown, I'm going to pack my case. I'll leave without a sound, disappear without a trace." Ark went to the recruiting man, then he went away. Ark laid low, mostly did what he was told, asked few questions, didn't really care. He blended in as best he could. He shined his boots until they were mirror bright. He ironed his shirts until the creases were knife sharp. He went to places he had not been. He did things he had not done. And when he could, he ran 1 mile, 2 miles, 3, 5. He focused on putting one foot after another, looking ahead. And when he could, he drank 2 bottles, 3 bottles, 5, 7. And he tried hard to focus on nothing at all, tried not looking back. He got up every morning, made his bed, put on his boots, went to breakfast. He did these things over and over and over. Yet even on the best days, it was not enough. And another song that's referenced is Hearts of Stone, which was actually written by Bruce Springsteen, who I'm sure everyone has heard of. But it was recorded and became the first and became the biggest hit by Bruce Springsteen's friend, Southside Johnny. And so if you've ever heard a Southside Johnny song, it's probably this song, Hearts of Stone. And again, there's a little line or a couple of lines from that, from those lyrics. And you cry because things get so strange so fast. And you cry because nothing good ever lasts. There are few things worse than a crying drunk. Ark had only been one once. It was a year and a month later. He was in some dirt bar in a harbor town somewhere south of where he wanted to be. And he knew for certain now he was away. It was his choice to escape, a choice once made that was irreversible. Now, in pity and shame, Ark stares at the dank floor, a mix of uneven wood and patches of busted linoleum. He knows this kind of place harbors no type of sympathy. Still, he wanders over to the unplugged jukebox, reads the choices, an odd mix of country, rock, and soul, pulls a token from his pocket, puts it back among some coins, breathes hard, squares himself. Tomorrow, he thinks, I'll still be away. I'll still be away. So when you run away from your troubles, often you have to come back to face them. And so that's what Ark is doing in these next few poems. And he's driving, entering Pennsylvania from the south. So he's coming into central Pennsylvania, but from, you can imagine, from the Baltimore area. If you've ever driven up that way, you might recognize some of the, I don't know, it's just a weird landscape coming up that way. Ark drives into the night. A big rig is coming up fast. Its lights go from far to closer to close. Barely keeping it between the white lines, Ark welcomes distraction. 100 miles, maybe less, but 100 is a good number when more turns out to be less. Then less is better, a boost. State line sign, then gone. The big rig that was riding his donkey faded off on the hill climb. Lights in the distance, York. Then Camp Hill. We might go east shore all the way in daylight, but too many hills and curves, woods and deer for nighttime. Instead, Ark takes the low river road with nothing much for 60 miles, but porn shops, cheap motels, and truck stops. 60 miles, 59, 58. Radio has country, preacher preaching, preaching, country, pop, pop, preaching, country, pop. The moon mirrors on the river, the water low and flat as the road. 37, 34, a few more miles of darkness. And this was just called Away. Ark walks tall and alert, his head swiveling at regular intervals, left, then right, then left again. Next time, the reverse. He walks all the way up the street, past the unused tracks at the east end of town, just before the hill, then back down the other side. Twice people wave to him. Twice he nods back, keeps moving. It's too early. He does not think he can talk, not yet. But by now, the shops are either closing or putting on their lights. Ark turns sharp down 3rd Street, moves along the tracks for half a block, then pulls open the heavy wood door of Tony's Tavern. He walks to the far side of the empty U-shaped bar, sits down. She comes out from the back room kitchen, grabs a bottle from the cooler, uncaps it, and places it in front of Ark. Water beads on the cold bottle in the warm air. Ark grips it like a buoy in an open sea. "Where the hell you been?" says she. "Away," he replies, and looks her up and down. This next poem is called Farther Down Up the Road. There's a song by Bobby Blues Band that was re-recorded by a bunch of people, including Eric Clapton, called Farther Down the Road. But I added another word in there. I like the way it sounds. Farther down up the road. Ark's mind spins like a top. She stands there, asks question. Some he hears and some he does not. The whole time there's a red noise in his head that churns in fast, irregular intervals like an off-kilter carousel. "Ain't been back much. Heard you have a kid now," Ark says, looks as close as he can to her. "Yeah, she's almost 2. Ark makes a gesture, knocks over his now half-empty beer. Liquid puddles on the scarred oak bar. She fetches a rag, mops it up, tosses the bottle in the bin. "New hand?" she asks. Ark smiles a small smile. She starts to talk again, but looks away. In an involuntary single motion, she reaches into the cooler and grabs another beer, sets it in front of Ark. "You still like this kind?" she asks. "I switch, but it'll do for now," Ark says, and swallows the bile that's risen to the back of his throat. Okay. I forgot to mention, I'm sorry, because there's a transitional poem where you learn that Lilith is now working in a bar instead of the hospital, because the hospital had layoffs. Imagine that. One of my favorite writers is Harry Crews, who grew up in rural South Georgia in the Depression. And he had a pretty rough life. And the saying that's attributed to him is, "Survival is triumph enough." And I use that for the title of this poem. Everyone knows the south end of town is lower. The neighborhood streets share dangerous drops off Front Street. Drivers not wanting to belly scrape must baby crawl, watch the angle going up or down, ever mindful of that incline. Across Front Street, just past the pavement, a 10-foot high wall runs parallel to the river. Concrete near a foot thick, built to hold back floodwaters. It did twice in years long past. Some say it won't hold again. You never know. If you ask the right ones, a few might tell you a story about Ark and the wall, how Ark was running his cycle machine up and down Walnut Street one night, gearing down near the end, turning around and winding through the gears again, the engine sounding higher and louder as he sped closer to front. Heard tell after one run, he simply braked, made a left onto front, then another onto the bridge, the highway, and then who knows? Some guy said he saw him months later at a truck stop up in the mountains 100 miles distant. Wouldn't let on who he was, left quick. Another fellow said he was on vacation down south and saw a guy walking toward him on the street, spitting image. The guy just nodded back and disappeared into the crowd. Every so often, a jack wink at the spit of sense might say he saw Ark in town. at the fair a few years back, or walking near the abandoned tracks past East Chestnut. It's all a lie. On that moon bright night, Ark hit 90, 100, 110 miles an hour, hit the end of Walnut and boomed up that ramp and just kept going and going. The moon was close high in the southern sky, illuminating Clement Island and the distant shore. And Ark was steady rising until he disappeared. Doubt he's coming back. That poem's near the end. It's not the last poem in that book, but it's kind of near the end. After I wrote that book, I was it's hard to tell if you're just listening to me, but all the lines in the whole book have 10 syllables. And so I had to really carefully construct the lines, and I had to then make one poem lead into another, and it took a long time to do all that. So I got so sick of doing that I decided to write a book of prose poems. So that's what I'm working on now. And I'll read one or two. I have a little bit of time left. I'll read one or two from they're like new poems. A couple of these have gotten published so far, but I'm still working on the collection. This one is called GAR. And so if you go to cemeteries, you might see a little a medallion, or maybe actually on a tombstone, then GAR and a symbol, and that meant that person was a veteran of the Civil War and fought for the Grand Army of the Republic, which is what the Union Army was called. And this is called GAR. As your mother digs her paltry garden at the foot of the yard in your latest rented house, the metal of her shovel strikes something solid. You phone your buddy to come over. Though you are high school kids, athletes in good shape, it takes the better part of an hour to dig out the large, smooth stone, which turns out to be a tombstone for a Grand Army of the Republic veteran. At your mother's direction, you wheelbarrow it over to the house, place it face down, use it as a final back porch step for the rest of the time you live there. It never bothers you that there is a dead man buried in the yard next to where you park the car. You walk over him nearly every day. You only wonder what he's been doing there these past 100 years, how he looks, how he feels. There are lots of bodies in this town. It's old and ghosts run free. Or at least that's what you've heard. Ancient men at the Chestnut Inn sometimes argue, their voices betraying faint accents of their Pennsylvania German ancestors, about whether it was 2 or 3 haunts who roamed the top floor of the old Neff Hotel right up until it was torn down a few years back. At recess, kids stand around on blacktop schoolyards and talk about the hermit up on White's Hill who died before they were born. His body found frozen one January, his spirit still restless in the woods that thicken past the creek. You think it all Halloween stuff, except that one midsummer night just after you graduated school, when you walked the derelict railroad bridge. The air was thick with fog and the moon a dulled blur behind it. You stepped the ties, listened to the water gurgle underneath. Halfway across, you stopped, lighted a cigarette, then heard voices. Though your pace slowed a bit, you kept going, saw 2 figures appear, still indistinct, only yards away. It was just 2 stoners who hissed a greeting as they passed like snakes, more afraid of you than you were of them. On a Sunday night, a few days later, you sat on the back porch of your house, your feet resting on the tombstone step while you drank a beer. You stared over at the back end of the church, just up and across the alley. You could hear the preacher preaching his holiness gospel, his voice rising like a threat. just read two more, maybe one. I didn't really know who my biological father was for a long time. And then only recently, like 3 or 4 years ago, I was able to make a connection through, the DNA testing, the ancestry, and I found a match for this woman who was my biological cousin. And she, we figured out that I belonged to her family. And it's a whole complex reason why I didn't know, but that will take longer. But I went, the point is I went down to a family reunion in South Carolina, in this little town in South Carolina. And this is called First Visit South Carolina. You have your picture taken with the bronze statue of the jazz man, a native son, now acclaimed to fame. He is larger than in life. He stands 30 yards away from the main corner of town with its 4 pillars: the church, the town hall, the bank, the market. The market is the old slave market. They don't use it for anything anymore, but keep it up just the same. Its paint is blazing white in the summer sun. Later, you drive to the cemetery to look for family plots. Find a few, but not the one you seek. You spot sinkholes near graves bearing the same last name as the famous jazz man. It is all unkempt, unmown, littered with fallen branches from dead trees, divided by a dusty, rutted 2-wheel path. Were it near dusk, it might remind you of a setting in a B-grade horror movie, but it lacks irony. Traversing the town, you cruise through the business district. You remark at businesses with your family name. Those aren't our people, your cousin says, in a way that implies something more. It is in the same manner an uncle side smiles at you, doesn't say much, like he is figuring whether you should be let in on the family secret that isn't much of a secret. You already know parts of it. Upon graduation, a collection is taken, and by bus or train, the young head north to Baltimore or New York, are told to make a life away from here. When your uncle does talk, he points across the road at overgrown fields, says whose house used to stand there, talks about places in the neighborhood taken for taxes when the occupants got old, put in a home. Your daddy used to stay over there, he says, and points toward an indistinct spot. The next day, you travel a boulevard where houses on large lots are set back from the street. They are 2-story with wide steps leading to wide front porches. On one set of steps are guardians, dual 3-foot-high gray sentries. You recognize their countenance. Soon you take a left toward the river and the old railroad tracks. Steamboats used to carry cotton and tobacco downriver to the docks in Charleston, sometimes human cargo back upriver. There is an old brick church. You're not sure if it is still used. This is where Sherman encamped after Atlanta, after Savannah, on his way to North Carolina. You wish there was a way to travel back in time, to whisper in Sherman's ear, to tell him to finish the job. It doesn't matter. He wouldn't have listened. He was already dreaming the American dream of commerce, of going west and killing Indians. Now I'll finish up with just one short poem. I'll jump back to Ark, and this is when he is kind of living on his own for the first time, and he goes back to visit this place where he used to hang out a lot as a kid in this old railroad yard. And the one thing that the building that still stands there is that yard master's tower, this big kind of tower square building that had glass all around it and a walkway all around it. So the yard master, the person who controlled the yard, rail yard, could see everything that was going on with the trains. The yard master's tower. Ark flies into the night, going farther each time. Darkness seeks to envelop him as he casts off fiery sparks, burning into a velvet sky. He wakes in a sweat The darkness of this room returns slowly to its dullness. Still an hour from first light, Ark dresses in jeans and a ragged flannel shirt, boots. His feet tap a slow rhythm in the brick alley, up steel steps. One flight, then two. He sits on a rusty deck, looks over the old rail yard. A memory rises, nearly as gone as this place itself, now lit in pink orange. He pulls a worn token from his pocket and considers it a moment, then rises and walks steadily into the full golden chill of morning, happy for the day. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much. This has been wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah. I'm sure other people will have things to say, but I so much appreciated when you started reading, and I thought instantly the joy of hearing the written word read and the role of poetry and how instantly our brain waves change, and we're in what you're telling us so perfectly. And your exquisite views of Ark and the small things of life that matter so much. The detail work in the poetry was absolutely stunning. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, one of the things I not done as many readings as normally because of COVID, but yeah, I was trying to tell people that this is, I'm sort of basing it out loosely on Sunbury, but it's an actual town, but it's a place of still of imagination, so it's not like a travel log like the but there's like but I always was impressed by different places in town. I used to, when I was a little kid, used to love just to walk around and just check out places and talk to people. And it was a much different era when I was little. I don't think that you would see as many little kids wandering around town, going up to people and talking to them. But it was something I used to love to do, and just notice things about towns.
Melinda, you had something, you had your hand up.
Yes, so having been in the military myself, I appreciated the poem about the military, like the same thing every day, so I appreciated that. And I just wanted to ask, like, do you find it harder to get poetry published than if you were just like going to write a novel or something like that, or any other type of nonfictions?
I think it's hard regardless of the genre. Poetry might have the additional burden in that you're not going to make any money from it, or very little.
Right.
Some people write a novel, and they might get it published and you're going to make some money, but most poetry doesn't garner you that much. And I've been fortunate. The last couple of books I've worked with a press out of Kentucky called Finishing Line Press, which has become a pretty sizable publisher of poetry. But so that's been fortunate, and I'm hoping that I can work with them on this new book that I'm working on. But but more, I tell my students we're actually working on Thursday on polishing work and getting it ready to send out. And I'm like, most journals are accepting 1% to 2%. 2% is high. It's on the high range. So you really, so you got to keep plugging. I have a bunch of stuff out now, probably to 8 different. I think since the beginning, like let's say since the beginning of August, I've sent out to 10 places. Most I haven't heard back from, but I think I heard back from 2 already that said no. So, and I'm pretty well into my career now, but I also know, like, for example, I studied with James Tate, who won the Pulitzer Prize, right? And he we were talking one day outside of our classroom building, and he's like, "Oh, so and so just sent me a rejection letter." This guy just had won the Pulitzer Prize, and he was still getting rejection letters from journals. So
Sure.
it's hard. It's hard regardless of the genre. But.
Okay. Thank you.
So I have a question. And you probably get this from lots of groups, but do you have some kind of writing routine? How do you fit writing into sort of the rest of your life?
Yeah, that's really, really hard, especially, well, it doesn't really matter what the job is. But I've been fortunate, like this year, or this fall, I have a schedule where I don't have any classes on Fridays. And so I try to get as much grading done in during the week and often on the weekend, actually almost always on the weekend, but I try to work on my writing on Fridays. That's not as much as I would like, but I also feel like I'm fortunate in a profession where I have some time off in the winter and I have some time off in the summer, and I have some good support from my school. I won a fellowship to the Vermont Studio Center that was funded by my school. And so I'm going to go up there as soon as classes are done in May and just have a couple of weeks just to sit and write. And that's a really great, because it's hard just even at home. It's, my kids are grown and everything, but just to get yourself out of that day-to-day routine, like, oh, I wonder what's on television, or maybe I should take my dogs for a walk. But if you're states away, you're like, okay, my job here is just to write. And I was able to do that a couple of years ago, to go to a writing retreat. And I worked from finishing up Artemas and Arc, and I worked from like 6 a.m. till 6 p.m. every day for 2 weeks. And because that's what I was there for. And I didn't have to worry about going to the grocery store or walking my dogs. So, but you try to make time as best you can. Some people are, I think most people aren't into that. Like, you need to write some every day, but you need to write regularly. I think that's the important part, regularly. One thing I will point out that helps me and helps my some of my friends is we have a monthly group that meets, right? And we all have to bring in new work to share. So these are all poets. Just about everybody in the group, even though we're in a small town in central Pennsylvania, just about everybody in the group has published. A couple of us have books. And so we all have some credentials, and we feel a responsibility to the group, right? To not call off. It's sort of like a gym buddy, right? Like it would be the same thing. Like, okay, you're supposed to meet for yoga at a certain time and you don't show up, and then your friend is like disappointed in you. So we do that. Even that once a month is like, oh, that's coming up. I really need to polish this poem and get it a little better so I can get some good feedback on it. So even those little things help. And I know my students sometimes do that with each other. They'll form little writing groups after we've had a class in something. They go, we want to continue this. And so they form an informal group outside of class.
Pressy and I are looking at this ideal very longingly.
It's great. Yeah. We had to go virtual for a while with you're talking about the writing group. Yes, we had to do virtual for a little while, and when everybody was able to get their second vaccination, and we were able to meet outdoors and felt comfortable, we've done that. And one of the people among us is a nurse, and so she keeps us in line.
I have been lucky enough to teach some fiction classes, and they are pretty good. It doesn't take them too long to say, we want to do something that if we want to comment, we'll set up something. And I say, you set it up because I don't want to get involved in this. But they really want to be able to look at each other's work more than what we have the class time, even though classes tend to run long. And it's wonderful because you have the class energy and all of that. And then after that, they will talk to each other about what they want to read from somebody else. And, that's about as close as we're able to have a real get together at this point in our lives, but it is a real get together. It's a way for, we desperately need those things to hang on to the real things that we care about in life.
No, certainly, yes.
I love your poem about driving up from Baltimore. That you can guess I have done that many times. And, that when you said state line, it's like, I absolutely could see that sign. And, in the ways that the beautiful parts about writing, that things hit somebody so hard because it's something they have actually known or something close to it. And but of all, and I don't want to say that I didn't feel the same way about a lot of the other poems too. There were some exquisite things, like I said earlier, that touched me very much. The family reunion one, particularly, and some of your detailed work of living in a small town, just stunning, and the lives people are leading. But yeah, I could, and the truck lights, I thought, yep, I never thought of writing a poem about the truck lights, but I don't have to worry about that now because Jerry's done it. So
Glad to be of service.
thank you.
Jerry, I just wanted to say thank you for sharing your work with us. And I'm from a small town, and I think people from small towns can probably relate to a lot of the themes where, like the town is really rooted in the past and what has always been, but then there's the individual interacting with that. And, sometimes it feels like things are just stuck in the past, but then there's new things coming ahead. So it was very interesting to hear about, to hear your poetry, and also, your descriptions in between were very helpful too. So thank you for sharing.
Oh, you're welcome. Yeah, as I tried to say in the beginning, this is that narrative strain. There's a couple of narrative strains going on through here, and this one was particularly a strain about Ark and his romantic relationship as it develops, or not. But I really started this whole book as kind of thinking about as an apology. I read in the newspaper, my hometown newspaper, a couple of years ago, several years ago now, about a guy who died, and he was one of those people who had some mental health issues and wandered around town, and kids made fun of him, and people just didn't really pay attention to him, and he but it was clear that he had some affliction. And although I never really kind of like yelled at him and made fun of him as many young kids did in our town, I did sort of mock him in a way, because my friend and I took a picture of him and put it in our high school yearbook. And obviously it was to make fun of this guy. So that was, so I thought about that because I read his obituary, and I read about a loss that he suffered, and how he was never quite the same after that, and became the person that we as high school kids and later on recognized, and how he had a family and people who cared about him. And it just, it was kind of a dumb thing to realize that late in life, but it hit me like, we are just jerks. And of course, everybody has a story. And so I started to write this, not his story necessarily, because I didn't know it and it was his to tell, not mine. But just, he was sort of like the impetus, like, who are these people who are in these towns and who are sometimes forgotten, who are sometimes scorned, who are just living on the margins. And so the Artemas character is very much that. And there's a connection between Artemas and Ark. So I didn't even get into Artemas at all, who's mostly in the first half, but he's also in the second half of the book, because then we'd be here too long. But really, it was just, I kept thinking about, as I read this guy's story, I kept thinking about other people that I knew who made an impression on me when I was a little kid, who I could tell were on the margins, who through one thing or another weren't really incorporated into the society of town. They were kind of pushed to the side. I guess in some ways, I think they stand for in place of as a metaphor for entire communities, because a lot of these towns have lost population, have lost jobs. In the town of Sunbury, and one of the things I reference in one of the final poems in the book, the final poem in the book, is this bypass that's being built around Sunbury, and so you'll have no reason to ever go there. And I've seen that happen to other towns, right? That where a bypass, like you used to go through a little town, and then all of a sudden there's a bypass, and you don't even notice that town anymore. And so that kind of stunts it even further. I don't know. So I guess I kind of like small towns, and I kind of like Central Pennsylvania, and so it just engages me. It's just something I'm always thinking about.
You referenced something earlier about the with small towns, that the kind of we kind of talked about it a little bit, the being stuckness, and then but not, and the people do go away, as you did, as most of us have done wherever we lived before. But then the interesting part often is that people come back. It's kind of like the kids go off, and the first thing we can do is run away. We don't want to ever be back there again. And then we end up going back in the area or the same town or the same house. And I know there's people in other countries doing the same thing too. Even go back and buy their parents' home and things. And it's kind of, they've come back and they're a whole different human being. They've had often great experiences out in the world and been very successful, or are being very successful still, and come back and sort of re-nourish the town. And but a lot of your poems have a wonderful sense of that going on behind them, even if it's not directly, when it's not directly discussing it, it's behind them. There's that sense of the change and the non-change and the stuckness and the going away. And it's a beautiful rhythm to it too.
Thank you. Yeah, there's always that. It's sort of like Whitman, right? Do I contradict myself? Very well, then I contradict myself, right? There's that dynamic there in a lot of these little towns. People talking about, and people my age, are like, when I was a kid, it used to be this way, but it's not that way anymore, and we can't live that way anymore. Sunbury and many of these towns are examples. Like, we had certain factories in town, but they haven't been around for a long time. So what are you going to do now? How are you going to do things?
This has been a treasure. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm glad to do it.
I said to students yesterday, the besides the joy of Zoom, which on the whole I love, for events like this, for its many reasons, as we said before. But I do miss the fact that we can't get our books signed.
Oh, yes.
And I think my students kind of having not had this experience yet, were very puzzled by that. But I know of course, what it was like to see people who had never been to a reading before and suddenly had to race up there and get a book and get it signed, and almost more importantly, talk to the author for a few moments and say, wow, this changed my life. And then those were the people who came back to every reading, and unfortunately, I think this maybe makes students think, oh, you're only going to go to this if you really want to write poetry, or you're an English major or something like that. And in fact, I keep saying to them, of course not. Has nothing to do with that at all. And it's just something that heals and enlivens your life and makes it huge. So the best argument I've ever heard, and administrators beware, best argument I've ever heard of why we need to have poetry and fiction in our lives in a classroom was a group of nurses that I was teaching when I first started at the college. And they went to their administrators and said, no, we don't want to take the course we're supposed to take. We want to take English Lit. So everybody took English 2 Lit. And I asked them the reason, and they said, because we already are dealing with death every day, and we have to have something to keep ourselves alive.
Yes.
And what they were doing was not just going home and staring at the television, it was going home and reading. And that stuck with me forever. That was one of those moments, like they just said something like a thunderclap, and you go, okay, I'm out of here. We can't improve on this. This is too good.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. One of my the writing group members is a nurse at Geisinger in Danville and has dealt with COVID patients, and she keeps coming to our group because it's like a highlight of her month, because she's seeing so much suffering daily, and so this is the idea of being involved with literature is really something that she appreciates.
Anybody else going to say something? I feel like I'm supposed to be teaching this. I'm not. I'm just I'm not the teacher. I'm just the inviter.
Oh, this was great. It was really, really great. Thank you so much for being with us, Jerry. And we appreciate that you're willing to do this over Zoom.
Okay, no problem. I'm glad to do it. And I guess if any students do listen and they have some questions, they could always email me. I'm pretty easy to find at Bloom, and be glad to answer any questions they might have.
Okay, is email the best way to reach you if students are interested?
Yeah, it's just jwemple@bloomu.edu. So yeah, I'm pretty easy to reach that way.
Thank you. We will let them know, and I know that they're the ones who will be doing stuff watching your recording, so you may get some comments from that. But thank you very much.
Thank you.
This has been a long-awaited treasure, but thank you for hanging in there.
No problem. Thank you guys, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you very much.
I'm going to stop the recording now.
Okay.